there is a number that puts Viking winter into immediate perspective. On the coldest nights in Norse Scandinavia, the interior of a longhouse, with the central hearth fire burned down to embers, could drop to 2 degrees Celsius, that is 35 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing. Inside the home, not outside in the wind, not on the open fjord, inside where families slept. Most people picture Viking winters as something these people simply endured through sheer toughness, fur-clad warriors indifferent to the cold, bred by generations of hard northern living into something less fragile than the rest of us. That picture is wrong. Every single winter was a precision survival problem, and the margin between solving it correctly and dying before spring was razor thin. The Vikings did not conquer winter, they negotiated with it. And the terms of that negotiation were stranger, more biological, and more psychologically demanding than almost anyone realizes. This is what Viking winter actually looked like, and by the end, the system they built to survive, it will look less like ancient improvisation and more like something we are still using today. Before going any further, let's be precise about what we are talking about. The Viking Age ran roughly from 793 CE, the raid on Lindisfarne, to 1066 CE. The core Norse settlements we will focus on are in Scandinavia, primarily modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, as well as the Norse colonies in Iceland and Greenland. These were not uniformly cold places. Norway's climate varied significantly by latitude and coastline, but the settlements we care about most for winter survival were inland and northern, places like the Trondheim region, the interior valleys of Norway, and the Norse farms of Iceland. These were places where winters lasted 5 to 6 months, where the ground froze solid, where the sea ice could lock out fishing for weeks, where the sun, at winter solstice in Trondheim, rose for just 5 hours and 50 minutes and then was gone again. That is the environment. Now let's talk about what happened inside it. The Longhouse was the center of everything, and it was not what most people imagine. Viking longhouses were not primitive huts. They were precision engineered for their climate, built with thatched or turf roofs that provided insulation comparable to modern fiberglass batting. Walls were thick, sometimes double-layered, with turf packed between wooden frames. The floor was sunken slightly below ground level, using the earth itself as a thermal buffer. The central hearth sat in the middle of the structure, with a hole in the roof above it for smoke. But the design was intentional. The fire warmed the entire interior volume before the heat could escape. Archaeological excavations, particularly at Stong in Iceland, a Norse farm preserved almost perfectly under volcanic ash like a Norse Pompeii, show us exactly how these structures were laid out. There was a main hall for the family, a sleeping area along the long walls, and at one end, separated by only a partial partition, the byre, the animal quarters. This is not incidental, this is the engineering. A single adult cow produces approximately 1,000 BTUs of body heat per hour. That is the thermal equivalent of a small electric space heater running continuously. Every hour of the night, fueled by nothing but the animal's own metabolism. A household with 4 cows, 6 sheep, and a handful of goats, which was not unusual for a mid-status Norse farm, was generating somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 BTUs of animal body heat per hour around the clock, in a structure designed to retain that heat, with a suppressed hearth maintaining embers overnight. Those animals raised the interior temperature by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius above what it would have been without them. Think about what that actually means. 5 to 8 degrees is the difference between 2 Celsius and 7 to 10 Celsius. It is still cold by any modern standard. But in a world with no central heating, no insulated sleeping bags, no synthetic materials, those degrees were the margin of survival. That slow, warm biological engine running in the dark, cattle and sheep breathing in the black, was the primary heating system of Norse civilization for centuries. We will come back to what that cost them. But first, the other problem, the one that started months before the first frost. Food. A Viking adult performing winter labor, hauling firewood, tending livestock, Breaking ice on water sources needed somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 calories per day just to maintain their core body temperature. Not to grow stronger, not to do anything productive, simply to stay alive and functional in sustained cold. Children needed proportionally less, but they were also more vulnerable to any caloric deficit. Here is the critical constraint. Once the ground froze in late October or November, no new food could be grown or gathered in most Norse settlements. Everything the household needed to survive until the spring thaw, which might not come until April or May, had to already be stored. The entire agricultural year was structured around this single calculation. How much do we need? How much do we have? And what happens if we are wrong? A miscalculation of even 10 to 15% in winter food stores did not mean people went hungry. It meant people died. The archaeological record is unambiguous about this. Norse skeletons from burial sites across Scandinavia and Iceland show Harris lines in their bones. Harris lines are horizontal growth arrest bands that form when the body stops allocating resources to growth because it does not have enough calories to maintain basic function. They are the bone's own record of starvation episodes. These lines appear in Viking Age remains with striking regularity, and they cluster at ages corresponding to late winter and early spring. The hunger gap. The Norse knew it. Every generation knew it. So how did they fill those stores? And here is where most people have the picture completely wrong. The dominant assumption about Norse diets is that they ate meat. Beef, pork, game. The warrior's diet. And they did eat those things. But meat, even smoked or salted, was not the caloric backbone of Viking winter survival. The real answer is a fish that most people today barely think about. Cod, specifically stockfish. Cod that had been split, gutted, and hung on wooden racks in the open air to dry in the cold, salt-free Norwegian coastal wind. The drying process, which took 2 to 3 months, removed roughly 80% of the fish's weight in moisture while retaining nearly all of its protein. The result was a product that could be stored for years without refrigeration, could be shipped across continents without spoiling, and could be rehydrated and eaten anywhere. A kilogram of stockfish contained more protein than almost any other preserved food available in medieval Europe. Norse coastal communities in Norway, particularly in the Lofoten Islands, produced stockfish at industrial scale. The cod migrated there to spawn in vast numbers every winter, and Norse fishermen developed a preservation technique so efficient that it drove an international trade empire. By the 12th century, stockfish from Norway was feeding populations in Germany, Britain, and southern Europe. It was a product that started as a survival mechanism for one winter and ended up reorganizing medieval trade routes. But stockfish was only one layer. And here is where the real complexity of Viking food survival starts to become almost unsettling. The Norse were running at least 6 distinct preservation methods simultaneously. And the fact that they needed all 6 is itself the first warning sign about how close to the edge they were operating. Smoke from the same central hearth that heated the Longhouse crept upward through the building, and cured meats hung in the rafters, meaning that every hour of warmth was also an hour of food preservation. 2 survival problems solved by a single fire. Fermentation ran on a different logic entirely. Skyr, a strained dairy product similar to thick yogurt, could be kept through winter if handled correctly. But hakal, Greenlandic shark, fermented in sand for months and then dried, required a process so chemically precise in its ammonia expulsion that modern food scientists classify it as controlled decomposition rather than simple preservation. Get the timing wrong and the product was toxic. Get it right and it kept for months. Salting, pickling in whey, and root cellaring in earthen pits dug below the frost line rounded out the system, the pits maintaining a stable temperature that kept root vegetables alive without freezing them. Now here is what that picture actually means. This was not redundancy for comfort. Each method covered a specific failure mode in the others. If the smoked meat ran short, the fermented stores compensated. If the root cellar flooded or froze through, the stockfish held. If the stockfish supply failed because sea ice had locked out the Lofoten fishermen that winter, the household fell back on salted provisions. The system only worked because every layer was load-bearing. Pull one out and the whole calculation shifted toward the Harris lines in those bones. And that raises the question sitting at the center of all of this. How does a civilization running 6 distinct preservation methods simultaneously, with no written records, no standardized weights, and no refrigeration, keep all of them from failing at the same time? The answer reveals something more remarkable than any single technique. They developed extremely sophisticated practical knowledge passed through oral tradition and direct mentorship. Every experienced Norse farmer carried in their head an intuitive model of how much a household of a given size consumed per week, how much a given field produced in a good year versus a bad year, how many animals could survive winter on the stored hay supply. This knowledge was not written down. It was stress-tested across generations. And here is the uncomfortable precision of that system. The people who got it wrong did not leave descendants who got it wrong a second time. The oral tradition that survived was the oral tradition that worked. Natural selection was operating not just on bodies, but on knowledge itself. But that knowledge had a hard ceiling, because surviving winter was not only a problem of calories and architecture. There was a third threat, one the Norse could not smoke, salt, or store against, and it operated from the inside now: the darkness. This is the part most people never think about. In Trondheim at winter solstice, the sun rises at roughly 10 in the morning and sets before 2 in the afternoon. In northern Norway and Iceland, there are weeks when the sun does not clear the horizon at all, 20 or more hours of darkness, day after day, for months. What does that do to a human being? In the absence of light, the human brain produces excess melatonin, the hormone that signals the body to sleep, conserve energy, and reduce activity. Cortisol, which drives alertness and motivation, drops and becomes dysregulated. Serotonin production falls. The result is a suite of symptoms so predictable and universal that modern medicine has a name for it: seasonal affective disorder, depression, fatigue, cognitive slowing, social withdrawal, increased aggression, disrupted sleep architecture. Norse society did not have a clinical name for this, but the physiological reality was built into every corner of their culture. And here is where it gets strange. The Norse calendar was not structured around agriculture alone. It was structured around the psychological demands of extreme darkness. The festival of Yule, which we now call Yule, held at the winter solstice, was not optional. It was not recreational. It was mandatory communal gathering, scheduled by religious and social obligation at the exact moment when the human brain, deprived of light for weeks, was most vulnerable to isolation-induced collapse. The jaw-level feasts that the sagas describe could last 12 days. Every member of the community was expected to attend. Mead was consumed in quantities that, from a purely neuroscientific standpoint, made a great deal of sense. Alcohol temporarily elevates mood by acting on serotonin and dopamine pathways. The ritual sacrifice of animals, the blot, served a dual function. It was spiritual ceremony, and it was the precise moment when fresh meat entered the diet after weeks of preserved foods, a caloric and psychological event simultaneously. This is the part of Viking winter survival that is most underappreciated. The social architecture was as load-bearing as the Longhouse architecture. Isolation in deep Norse winter was not just uncomfortable. It was a medical crisis waiting to happen, and the culture built an immune response into its religion. What survival mechanism do most modern societies still unconsciously run that mirrors this exact structure? Drop the answer in the comments, because the parallels go further than most people expect. But the social system had a shadow side too. We will come back to what happened when it failed. Now let's go back inside the Longhouse and talk about the cost of that biological heating system. The interior atmosphere of a Longhouse where 4 or 5 humans slept alongside cattle, sheep, and goats was not pleasant. It was warm, which was the point, but it was also saturated with methane and carbon dioxide from animal respiration and digestion, ammonia from animal waste, particulate matter from the central fire, and a dense population of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that moved freely between animal hosts and human ones. Skeletal analysis from Viking Age Norse populations shows elevated rates of respiratory disease markers, bone changes consistent with chronic sinus inflammation, healed rib lesions that suggest repeated respiratory infections, dental wear patterns that indicate mouth breathing during sleep, which itself suggests compromised nasal passages. The people living in these longhouses were not breathing clean air. And then there were the zoonotic diseases that live in animals and jump to humans in conditions of close sustained contact. Influenza, brucellosis, various fungal lung infections. None of these were understood in the modern sense by Norse populations, but the exposure was constant. Living with your livestock was the thermal solution, but it was also an immunological arms race. The people who survived these winters were people whose immune systems had adapted to that environment over generations. Newcomers to Norse settlements, people who had not grown up in that specific biological ecosystem, had significantly higher mortality rates in their first winters. The Longhouse was a survival machine with a cost built into every breath, and that cost compounded over a lifetime. A Norse adult who had survived 40 winters in a Longhouse carried that biological record in their bones, in their lungs, in their immune system. The system preserved the community, but it aged the individual faster than almost any comparison population in the medieval world. That is the price the heating system extracted, paid quietly, one winter at a time. If this is the kind of history nobody teaches you, subscribe, because there is a great deal more of it. And now, here is where we are. Between the Longhouse architecture designed with turf walls and sunken floors to hold every BTU of heat, the livestock warming the interior through pure biology, the 6-layer food preservation system anchored by stockfish and fermented dairy, and the social engineering of Yule, mandatory communal gatherings scheduled with surgical precision at the darkest point of the year. The Vikings had built a complete winter survival system. It worked. For centuries, it worked. Norse settlements expanded north and west. Iceland was colonized around 874 CE and grew into a functioning civilization of tens of thousands. In 85 CE, Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland, a place so far north, so remote, so cold, that the journey itself killed people, and still they went, and still they built longhouses, and still they brought cattle, and still they held Yule. And for nearly 400 years, the Norse Greenland colony survived. 400 years. That is longer than the United States has existed. Then it collapsed. Between approximately 1350 and 1450 CE, the Norse Greenland settlements went silent. No war destroyed them. No plague swept through in a single season. The last written record from the eastern settlement describe a wedding in 1408 at the church of Whalsey. After that, nothing. When the first European explorers arrived in the 16th century, they found Norse ruins, empty farms, collapsed longhouses, bones of cattle that had died before their owners. The people were gone. And this is the part that changes how you see everything that came before. The reason the Norse Greenland colony collapsed was not a failure of the survival techniques they had. It was a failure to change those techniques when the environment changed around them. The medieval warm period, the relatively mild climate window that had made Norse expansion possible, was ending. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere began dropping in the 12th and 13th centuries toward what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. In Greenland, the growing seasons shortened. The pastures that Norse cattle depended on shrank. The sea ice that had been manageable became impassable for longer periods each year, and here is the cut that goes deepest. The Inuit were there, living in the same geography, in the same cold, surviving without longhouses, without cattle, without Yule feasts. They used kayaks to hunt ringed seals through sea ice. They built semi-subterranean sod houses designed for far more extreme cold than Norse. Longhouses, they ate seal fat, which provided caloric density and vitamin D that no amount of skekier or stockfish could match. They had solved Greenland winter using a completely different logic. The Norse could see this. They traded with the Inuit intermittently. Records of what the Norse called the Skraelings appear in several sagas, but they did not adopt Inuit technology. Not the kayaks, not the seal hunting methods, not the sod architecture, not the Dianot. 2 reasons, and both are uncomfortable. First, identity. The Norse were farmers. Being a farmer, owning land, raising cattle, producing grain, these were not just economic activities. They were the definition of what it meant to be a civilized person versus a savage. Adopting Inuit methods would have meant becoming, in their own cultural framework, something less than Norse. The identity could not flex, even when the survival system could not hold. But here is what makes that rigidity genuinely strange. The Inuit solution was not exotic or inaccessible. It was visible, proven, and geographically adjacent. So what force was powerful enough to make a civilization choose starvation over adaptation? Second, religion. By the 13th century, the Greenland Norse were devout Christians. Seal fat was associated with the Inuit pagans. The dietary and technological adaptations required to survive Greenland winter were entangled with cultural and religious boundaries. The Norse were not willing to cross. They starved. They froze. Generation by generation, the population shrank. The cattle died when the pastures failed. The crops failed when the frost came earlier each year. The Longhouse architecture, perfectly engineered for Scandinavian conditions, was not engineered for the colder, more volatile climate of collapsing Greenland, and nobody changed the plan. The Inuit are still there. Modern climate scientists study the Norse Greenland collapse specifically as a case model for civilizational climate rigidity. It is one of the earliest, best documented examples of a human society with a sophisticated survival system failing not because the system was insufficient, but because the people inside it could not adapt when the parameters changed. The lesson was not about toughness. It was about flexibility, and it was written in the bone record of an entire colony. Now step back from Greenland and look at the whole picture at once. The little ice age that finished the Greenland Norse was not a local event. It was a hemispheric temperature shift, and the data embedded in that shift is more precise and more unsettling than the broad narrative suggests. Ice core records from Greenland show that mean annual temperatures dropped by 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius across the relevant period. That number sounds small, but Norse cattle pasture viability collapsed at a threshold of roughly 1 degree of sustained cooling below the medieval warm period baseline. The margin between a functioning colony and a failing one was less than a single degree of average temperature, sustained over decades. The Norse Greenland collapse was not a dramatic environmental catastrophe. It was a slow arithmetic problem that the civilization's rigid infrastructure could not solve. The rest of the Northern Hemisphere felt the same pressure for the next 3 centuries. Crop yield collapses across Europe, famines that preceded the Black Death, political geography rewritten by food scarcity. The Norse Greenland colony was the canary, and the specific vulnerability it displayed, a survival system too brittle to adapt to incremental climate change, is the same vulnerability that modern climate scientists flag in contemporary infrastructure engineered for historical climate norms now being exceeded. This is not metaphor. The Norse Greenland case appears in IPCC working group reports and in climate adaptation literature as a historical precedent for the consequences of infrastructure inflexibility. Viking winter survival was not an ancient curiosity. It was a stress test of what happens when civilization meets climate at the edge of what its systems can handle. And now, the number from the very beginning of this script, 1,000 BTUs per hour from a single cow. Hold that. The reason Norse livestock integrated longhouse architecture persisted in rural Iceland and Norway well into the 20th century was not nostalgia. It was not poverty. it was because it still worked. Engineers who studied traditional Scandinavian vernacular architecture in the early 1900s were documenting farmhouses where the animal quarters were still attached to the human dwelling, where the thermal mass of the livestock still contributed meaningfully to winter heating. These were not people who had not yet discovered modern heating. Some of them had access to it and chose not to install it because the traditional system was cheaper, more reliable in remote areas, and required no fuel that could run out. What the Norse farmer in 900 CE understood intuitively about integrated biological heating systems, modern building science has formalized into principles of passive heating, thermal mass, and combined space climate design. The logic of the Longhouse appears in contemporary sustainable architecture, in earth-sheltered homes, in livestock integrated farming operations that capture animal heat for building warmth in cold climates. The cow producing 1,000 BTUs in the dark of a Norse winter was not a primitive workaround, it was the prototype. Viking winter survival was, at its core, systems engineering. Not the heroic individual survival story we tell about these people, but something more sophisticated and more fragile than that. It was a set of interlocking biological, architectural, nutritional, and social systems, each one compensating for the weaknesses of the others, each one load-bearing in ways that only became visible when it failed. The food system had to work because the heating system was already at its limit. The social system had to work because the darkness would break anyone left alone long enough. The livestock had to survive because without them, the heating, the food supply, and the farming cycle all collapsed together. It worked for hundreds of years across some of the harshest environments human beings had ever tried to inhabit, and it failed the moment it could not change. The question that this leaves open, the one that should sit with you after this video ends, is whether the line between those two outcomes was ever really about technology or toughness. The Norse had remarkable technology and extraordinary toughness. What they did not have, in the end, was the ability to look at a neighbor solving the same problem with completely different tools and decide that survival mattered more than identity. That is not a Viking problem. That is a human one. If this video made winter feel different to you, like something with weight and consequence, rather than just a season, then like it so the algorithm shows it to someone else who needs to see it. Subscribe if you want more history explored at this depth, the kind that changes what you thought you knew. And when you are ready for the next one, there are 2 videos on screen right now. Both are worth your time. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.